A Mother by James Joyce is the 13th short story published in the 1914 collection titled Dubliners. This realist fiction is set in the early 1900s in Dublin, Ireland. This modernist short story is from the third-person anonymous point of view. Click the link in the description box below for more Dubliners short stories. The tale begins with Mr. Holohan, who has been busy all over Dublin for a month, setting up a series of concerts. But it was the persistent Mrs. Kearney who handled most of the work. Mrs. Kearney, formerly Miss Devlin, had been educated at a prestigious convent and was known for being difficult and stubborn, with few close friends. During her courtship years, she was so particular that no young man could win her over. However, when people began to gossip, she settled down with Mr. Kearney, an older bootmaker, who she thought would make a decent husband, though she never completely let go of her romantic ideals. Mr. Kearney provides well for his family, and their daughter Kathleen receives a brilliant education and learns to play music. When a revival of Irish arts begins, Mrs. Kearney tries to build Kathleen's musical career. Mr. Holohan asks if Kathleen would perform as the piano accompanist for a series of 4 concerts. They agree to pay Kathleen 8 guineas, and Mrs. Kearney dives into the planning, putting together the program and being a good hostess to Mr. Holohan when he comes over. She also buys Kathleen some fancy clothes for the events. The concerts are set for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Mrs. Kearney and Kathleen arrive on Wednesday night just before the concert, but the hall is nearly empty. Backstage, they meet Mr. Fitzpatrick, another secretary for the society, who doesn't seem too worried. They wait until 8:30, hoping more people will arrive, but eventually, the few who are there demand the show begin. Mrs. Kearney quickly asks Mr. Holohan what's going on, and he admits that 4 concerts might have been too many. Mrs. Kearney is annoyed after all the trouble and expense for Kathleen's outfits. Mr. Fitzpatrick's laid-back attitude frustrates her even more. The Thursday show has a better turnout, but the society decided to cancel Friday and focus on Saturday's performance. Mrs. Kearney is determined that Kathleen still be paid for all 4 nights as promised, so she demands Mr. Holohan, who directs her to Mr. Fitzpatrick. He says he'll bring the issue to the committee, but this only makes Mrs. Kearney angrier. Mr. Kearney offers to join her at Saturday's concert to support her. Unfortunately, it rains on Saturday. When the Kearneys arrive, Mrs. Kearney hunts for Mr. Holohan and Mr. Fitzpatrick to discuss the payment. An older committee member, Miss Byrne, offers to help, but Mrs. Kearney insists on speaking with one of the secretaries. As they wait, various performers arrive. Mr. Duggan, a young bass singer with a good voice, is known for his bad habit of wiping his nose on stage, which ruined his debut at a big opera. The second tenor, Mr. Bell, is overly friendly but jealous of other singers. Kathleen is with her friend Miss Healy, the contralto for the night. Later, Madam Glynn, a quiet soprano from London, and the other singers show up. Mrs. Kearney takes Kathleen over to meet them, hoping her daughter will make good connections. Mrs. Kearney spots Mr. Holohan and immediately approaches him about Kathleen's payment. Once again, he tells her to discuss it with Mr. Fitzpatrick, but she raises her voice, demanding a clear commitment, and reminds him of their contract. Back in the dressing room, a journalist named Mr. Hendrick from the Freeman and a writer named Mr. O'Maddenburg are present. Although Mr. Hendrick can't stay for the concert, he promises a review and assures Mr. Holohan that Mr. O'Maddenburg will write it. Mr. Hendrick is enjoying attention from Miss Healy, who flirts with him. The 2 men then retreat to a quiet room, where stewards are opening drinks for a group of gentlemen, including Mr. O'Maddenburg. Mrs. Kearney is so loudly insistent about the payment that her husband asks her to lower her voice. The performers become anxious as the audience waits for the concert to begin. Mr. Holohan reappears, and Mrs. Kearney declares that Kathleen will not perform without the payment. He tries to appeal to Mr. Kearney and Kathleen, but Mr. Kearney just strokes his beard while Kathleen avoids eye contact. Feeling cornered, Mr. Holohan rushes off. The performers glance nervously at Mrs. Kearney. Soon, Mr. Holohan returns with Mr. Fitzpatrick, and they hand over half of Kathleen's payment, promising the other half later. Mrs. Kearney seems ready to argue, but Kathleen moves ahead to start with the first singer, Mr. Bell, who is now visibly shaky, worried that people might think he arrived late. The concert begins, and the audience is pleased overall despite Madam Glynn's poor singing. Backstage, the people divide into 2 groups. On one side, Mr. Holohan, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Miss Byrne, Mr. O'Madden Burke, two stewards, the baritone, and the bass discuss Mrs. Kearney's demands. Mr. O'Madden Burke is outraged, claiming Kathleen won't find work in Dublin again. When asked for his thoughts, the baritone says he'd prefer not to criticize but wishes Mrs. Kearney had been more considerate of the other performers. Across the room, Mrs. Kearney, her husband, Mr. Bell, Miss Healy, and a young woman who performed a patriotic recitation gather, with Mrs. Kearney angrily talking about her unfair treatment after all she'd done. Miss Healy feels torn, wanting to join the other group, but stays because of her loyalty to Kathleen. After the first half ends, Mr. Holohan and Mr. Fitzpatrick tell Mrs. Kearney the remainder of Kathleen's pay will be given on Tuesday. They warn that if she doesn't perform, the contract will be void, and Kathleen will receive nothing. Mrs. Kearney refuses, immediately insisting on full payment, or Kathleen won't play. The argument escalates and others start siding with the committee. In the end, Miss Healy reluctantly agrees to accompany the second half, and Mrs. Kearney storms out with her husband and daughter, vowing that their dispute isn't over. Mr. Holohan retorts coolly, "But I'm done with you." Mrs. Kearney exits, while Mr. Holohan fumes, reassured by Mr. O'Madden Burke that he did the right thing. Now let's look at the major themes of Joyce as a mother. The Era Abu Society, an arts group with a nationalist slope, attracts Mrs. Kearney more for the potential social connections than for any deep commitment to its cause. She cares more about Kathleen getting paid than about supporting the society's cultural mission. By showcasing Kathleen's Irish name, Mrs. Kearney demonstrates her superficial approach to the cultural revival, which Joyce critiques as provincial and fashionable. The performers, including Mr. Bell, show their own insecurities and rivalries, and none have particularly impressive achievements. The audience also has low expectations, satisfied by patriotic songs, and their small turnout reveals the limited appeal of the so-called revival of Irish arts. In her pride and stubbornness over Kathleen's treatment, Mrs. Kearney alienates everyone, ignoring the society's financial struggles due to the poor attendance. The concert is stalled because of Mrs. Kearney's fixation on securing Kathleen's payment until the Era Abu Society finds someone else to replace her. The concert series, organized by Mr. Holohan, is intended as a patriotic celebration of Irish culture, yet Mrs. Kearney's focus is solely on the money owed to her daughter. Despite the Society's mission to promote the Irish language and culture, the event feels unsuccessful and underwhelming. The poor lady sang Killarney in a bodiless gasping voice, with all the old-fashioned mannerisms of intonation and pronunciation which she believed lent elegance to her singing. She looked as if she had been resurrected from an old stage wardrobe, and the cheaper parts of the hall made fun of her high wailing notes. Mrs. Kearney's heavy involvement in the planning, along with her investment in Kathleen's attire, fuels her demand for the promised 8 guineas. However, her relentless insistence on Kathleen's payment damages her daughter's reputation and prospects in Dublin's music scene. Mr. O'Madden Burke predicts that Kathleen will never perform in Dublin again. Mrs. Kearney's attempt to elevate her family's status ironically ends in the loss of her daughter's career connections. Mrs. Kearney's efforts to organize the concert seem driven less by a desire for success and more by a need to boost her status. She has carefully shaped Kathleen's education, piano, French, and Irish studies, to display the family's cultural awareness and nationalist values. The concert is meant to showcase Kathleen as a rising star of Irish culture, but Mrs. Kearney's frustration with the disorganized society members, the venue, and artist selection reveals that she is more concerned with appearances than with Kathleen's success. As things fall short of her standards, Mrs. Kearney makes cutting comments to herself and criticizes Mr. Fitzpatrick's lower-class accent, though she refrains from openly mocking him, as she feels it would not be ladylike. Her attempt to elevate her social standing ultimately backfires, leaving her reputation tarnished. Mrs. Kearney argues that the society would treat her with more respect if she were a man. Mr. Holohan scolds her for her rude behavior toward the society, but his true judgment comes in his parting words. "I thought you were a lady." This comment reinforces Mrs. Kearney's suspicion of gender-based bias. However, while Mr. Holohan and Mr. Fitzpatrick may seem disengaged from the concert, they genuinely struggle to secure Kathleen's payment and show no intention of exploiting Mrs. Kearney. She is concerned not just about the payment but about receiving the respect she feels is due to her, though she is determined to act ladylike. Her inability to reconcile her need for respect with her desire to seem refined leads her to stand firm, refusing to adapt to the situation, and worsening her own reputation. Do subscribe for more Dubliners stories.